The morning sun filtered through the dust motes of the Greasy Spoon Diner, a place where the scent of burnt coffee and maple syrup had defined the town's social fabric for 50 years. Mrs. Evelyn Vance sat in her usual booth, the same one she had occupied every Tuesday morning since 1984. She was a woman of quiet dignity, a retired schoolteacher who had raised 3 children in a house she had paid off with decades of hard work. She had belonged to this town long before the estates at Ironwood had been carved into the hills. She belonged there long before the Homeowners Association existed. But in the eyes of the new regime, Evelyn was a legacy problem. Across from her stood a man who looked like a caricature of authority. He wore a black tactical vest with HOA enforcement, emblazoned on the back in white Velcro letters. His name was Miller. He didn't live in the town. He was a hired hand, brought in by Karen Whitlock, the HOA president, to clean up the image of the community. The diner fell into a tomb-like silence as Miller leaned over the table. In a calculated display of dominance, his large hand reached out and gripped Evelyn's jaw, forcing her head back so she had to look directly into his eyes. "I'm tired of talking to you, Evelyn," Miller hissed, his voice low but carrying in the quiet room. "You don't listen to the notices. You look like an ape in those clothes, and frankly, you belong in a zoo, not in a community with a vision. People like you are a blight. Why don't you just pack up and go back to wherever your people came from?" Evelyn was paralyzed. Coffee from her tipped mug soaked into her placemat, dripping onto her lap. She was a woman who had taught thousands of children to be kind, now pinned in a booth by a man treating her like property. Then, the bell above the diner door chimed. The return of the soldier. Elias Vance stepped into the diner, the desert tan of his combat boots still caked with a layer of dust from his final transport out of the theater of operations. He had been overseas for 18 months, surviving ambushes and IEDs, dreaming of the day he could sit across from his mother at this very booth. He didn't see a community vision. He saw a man's hand on his mother's face. He saw the terror in the eyes of the woman who had taught him how to be a man. In that moment, the vague, worried letters his mother had sent, the ones mentioning disagreements with the new neighbors, crystallized into a sharp, ugly reality. This wasn't a disagreement. It was a hunt. Elias didn't scream. He moved with the fluid, terrifying efficiency of a man trained to neutralize threats in seconds. Miller felt the air pressure change behind him. He started to turn, his hand releasing Evelyn's jaw slightly. "Mother, look at me," Elias said, his voice a low, vibrating bass that cut through the tension. Miller tried to reassert control. He stepped back, hand hovering over a can of mace on his belt. "Who the hell are you? This is an enforcement action. This woman stole utensils from the community center." It was a desperate, transparent lie. Elias didn't give him a second chance to fabricate a reality. When Miller reached for his belt, Elias intercepted him. The movement was a blur, a parry, a wrist lock, and a controlled takedown that sent Miller into the edge of a counter and then to the floor. The HOA enforcement vest did nothing to protect him from a man who had fought real monsters. Elias pinned him to the floor, his hands securing Miller's wrists. "Call 911, Elias told the stunned waitress. "Tell them there's been an assault and a hate crime at the Greasy Spoon." The backstory, gentrification and the vision. The conflict hadn't started in the diner. It had started 3 years prior, when the Ironwood development was greenlit. Karen Whitlock, a woman whose personality was a mix of corporate aggression and suburban vanity, was elected HOA president. She wanted a neighborhood that looked like a magazine spread, uniform, high value, and modern. To Karen, Evelyn Vance's modest 1950s ranch house, with its mismatched porch chairs and vibrant vegetable garden, was a visual liability. At first, the tactics were bureaucratic. Evelyn received notices for improper garden edging, a claim that her marigolds were non-native and distracting. Porch clutter, referring to the swing her late husband had built. Vehicle aging, a polite suggestion that her 10-year-old sedan lowered the street's aesthetic appeal. When Evelyn ignored these petty grievances, Karen escalated. She began mentioning community fit at board meetings, a coded language often used in modern housing disputes. According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, housing discrimination often takes the form of harassment, including threats or intimidation, intended to drive residents out of their homes. While HOAs have significant power, they are still subject to the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. The paper trail of hate. When the police arrived at the diner, they found a crime scene that was impossible to dispute. The diner's 4K security system had captured everything: the high-definition grip on Evelyn's jaw and the crystal-clear audio of Miller's racial slurs. Investigators soon widened their scope to the digital realm. When detectives mirrored Miller's phone, they didn't just find a rogue employee, they found a conspiracy. Karen Whitlock's messages to Miller were a roadmap of systemic abuse. Karen Whitlock, 10:14 a.m., she's at the diner. Make her uncomfortable, Miller. If she feels like she doesn't belong, she'll sell. Use whatever language you need to. We need that lot for the new clubhouse expansion. Apply pressure until she leaves. The abuse was not an accident, it was a policy. This reflects a broader trend of bias-motivated incidents in the United States. According to the FBI's 2022 hate crime statistics, the most recent comprehensive dataset, there were 11,634 reported hate crime incidents. Of those motivated by race/ethnicity/ancestry bias. Anti-Black or African American bias accounted for 3,424 incidents, representing over 50% of the racially motivated subset. Anti-white bias accounted for 966 incidents. Anti-Hispanic or Latino bias accounted for 724 incidents. The reckoning, court, and consequences. The legal system moved with a swiftness that suggested the town was tired of Karen's regime. Karen Whitlock was arrested during an HOA board meeting, the visionary president led out in handcuffs in front of the very neighbors she had bullied into silence. The HOA itself collapsed under the weight of federal lawsuits. Board members who had looked the other way found themselves personally liable for failing to prevent criminal activity. In court, the evidence was an anchor. The prosecution played the diner footage 3 times. Each time, the jury grew more somber. The sentences. Miller, the enforcer convicted of felony assault, false imprisonment, and criminal impersonation with hate crime enhancements. He was sentenced to 15 years in state prison. Karen Whitlock, the president convicted of conspiracy, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay $450,000 in civil damages, a sum that liquidated her personal estate. Restoration and final reflection. Restoration didn't come from a court order, it came from the townspeople. The following Tuesday, the diner was packed. Neighbors who had once stayed silent about the notices Evelyn received showed up with flowers and apologies. The Greasy Spoon Diner added a small brass plaque to Evelyn's booth. It didn't mention the assault. It simply said, Evelyn's booth, since 1984. Elias Vance stayed home. He traded his combat boots for work boots, helping his mother tend to the garden that Karen had tried so hard to destroy. He reflected on the central truth of the experience: fake authority only works in the dark. Once exposed to the light of documentation and the weight of the law, it collapses under its own cruelty. The final message of Ironwood is clear: power without legitimacy is dangerous, silence is a form of permission, and accountability is unavoidable when the truth is witnessed and confronted.